Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Geographic Society of Chicago's January Travelogue. I'm Nicolette Marassa from the GSC office, and I'll be moderating today's webinar. Just a reminder, if you have any questions throughout the presentation, please post them in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen, and we'll do our best to get to them time permitting. This is your first time attending a GSC event. Welcome and thank you for tuning in. The Geographic Society of Chicago has educated the public about geography and its important uses since 1898. Today's GSC trains students in the latest geospatial technologies. We offer unique educational experiences that harness the power of maps and integrative tools of GIS to solve environmental and community issues. Today's Travelogue presenter is Gene Flynn, a European travel and history expert. Gene will walk us through the culture and wine of Burgundy, Provence, and Cote du Rhone. Thank you so much, Gene, for being with us today and presenting on France.
I'm happy to be returning, Nicolette. So welcome, everyone. Should be a fun afternoon. You know, it's a cold day in Chicago, so we'll see some pictures of some wonderful, warmer weather in France. So we can look forward to our coming spring. So here we have, this is just a beautiful picture of a middle-sized town in France, a middle-sized wine town. But to notice the vineyards, the grapes. This is probably in July, certainly before the grapes are ready to pick, but we'll see other pictures of the vineyards in April and May, and it's clearly very early in the season then. So there are 17 wine regions in France, and they're displayed on this map here, and I had to pick 3 to focus on. But I'll also mention a couple areas that I have been to that did not make the list. But we'll be talking about the 3 of them, and the 3 are there in the middle with Burgundy, the Rhone wines, and then Provence wines down in the lower right. So when I started actually preparing this presentation for the annual meeting of the Geographic Society of Chicago, and as I was pondering what the issues were for wine. So there are 2 things I wanted to think about. One was the history of French wines, and secondly, what is the significance of wine to the French? Those were 2 things that I was interested in, and I thought the history would be very complex, and it wasn't as complex as I thought. But the significance of wine, the more I thought about it and did a little research, the more important that was. That was really the more difficult question. So first of all, let's look a little bit at the history before we look at individual wine regions. So there's a long history of wines in France. In the 6th century BC, so 8,000 years ago, the Greeks were planting grapes in France for wine. They recognized that this would be a great area for grape growing. And then there was a huge expansion of wine growing in the Roman era. And the Rhone River going right down to the Mediterranean, you know, they could easily bring the French wine over to Rome, where it was very, very important to the Romans. It wasn't necessarily the best wine at the time, and the Romans actually mixed it with water quite a bit, so to make it more palatable. But they certainly drank a lot of wine. Now, in the Middle Ages, wine making did some major improvements, largely with the monks who were cultivating the grapes and making wine. They experimented in doing things like wine presses and experimenting with different varieties of grapes. So the Middle Ages saw a lot of advancements in the knowledge of wine making. The French Revolution, it was disastrous to the wine industry. Rich people tended to order the best wines, so that fell out of favor. And many of the vintners Their wine processes were destroyed and their homes were destroyed. So the French Revolution was not kind to the wine industry. In the 1800s and even up till World War II, there was lots of negative issues. There was lots of diseases in the grape vineyards in the 1800s. The Depression and World War I and World War II was devastating to the wine industry. So after World War II, the established firms got back into making wine and champagne, but there, even more significantly, there was a new generation of wine growers that came into the field, and that they created a lot of the modern French wines that we know today. And we'll be talking about some of those individuals later in the presentation. So looking to the future of wine, there's lots of challenges right now. The most important one is the climate change. That the climate change in France and along the Mediterranean, it's bringing much later frosts. It's repeated heat waves and historic droughts. So the wine industry has had a lot of turbulence the last 20 years. And to adapt to this, growers are bringing back new varieties of grapes that will hopefully do better in the heat, and they're moving vineyards to new locations. So there's even talk of a growing wine industry in the Britain, which wasn't much the case, but further north in Europe, it's more friendly to grapes now because of the warmer weather. So the second topic here was then the significance of wine to the French. And it's hard to overstate the significance. It is really significant. First of all, wine is an integral part of family dining and the food experience in France. We see a picture here of a family gathering, but many French families, wine is served regularly at every dinner. They'll be serving wine. The teenagers will be drinking wine. It's part of the culture to share a glass of wine with friends and family. It's also a very big part of the regional identity. So each of the major French wine regions, they typically have a unique grape variety and winemaking traditions. And this contributes to the diversity of wines, but it also has a major impact on how those regions identify themselves. I mean, we know Wisconsin, we joke about the cheeseheads in Wisconsin at Green Bay Packer games. Well, cheese is very integral to the industry, to the culture of Wisconsin, and autos is integral to Detroit culture. But I think in France it's even more so because it's not only the wine growers there, it's the tourism that wines brings, it's the whole industry that makes the wine barrels and the glass. It's a significant part of employment in these regions, and in an area of France where the French view themselves as making the greatest wine in the world, and that's one of their premier offerings in the world. And then you look at the U.S. We have so many different things that we're the world leader of. In France, they take great pride in their French growing expertise and making that available to the world. Tourism is very important as part of wines. It's the many of these regions, when we think of the Cote du Rhone region, this was the first trip I took to France in many years, was back I think it was 2004. And the picture on the right shows a tour book with the Cote du Rhone Drive. So you could visit 6 or 8 vintners in the course of an afternoon or a full day on a predetermined road where it recommends where you might stop for some of the premier growers. And so this brings tourism, it brings hotels, it's very much part of the local economy. Symbol of excellence, as I talked about already. And the French take the quality very seriously, and they take the standards very carefully. So there's a very specific standard on what can be called champagne or what can be called Cote du Rhone wine. And it has to be in a very specific geographic area, and you could be 1 acre over from the defined area, and they can say you can't call your wine Cote du Rhone, that you can call it something else, but you can't call it Cote du Rhone. You have to be on this side of this demarcation. Even though it's the same grapes and it might taste the same, they say that doesn't matter. Cote du Rhone has to be from this. It's almost like a zip code. It has to be from these zip codes to call it Cote du Rhone wine. And part of the French view of wines, it differs somewhat from the US. We tend to buy wines based on the grape, Merlot or Chardonnay grape. The French, they say the grapes are important, but it's much more than the grapes themselves. It's the soil in a region. It's the slope of the hill and the climate, how cold it gets or how warm. All of these are factors. And in the French logic, there's a word for this. It's called terroir. And this is the sum of all these characteristics beyond the grapes. All of this comes into making a great wine or defining a grape. So here we're going to explore some of the wine regions. And first of all, visiting France, it's delightful. I've been there 6 or 7 times, anywhere from 1 week to 2 or 3 weeks at a time. And you can arrive in Paris airport and hop on an amazing train like this that will take you directly to the different wine countries or different parts of France. So, and you're operating on a train going 160 miles an hour that departs almost every hour and at a very modest cost. So it's just a wonderful train system. So first, though, I want to cover 3 regions that did not make the cut for this presentation, because I had to pick 3. The first one is the Champagne region, and in the region northeast of Paris, Rennes is the center of the Champagne regions. And here we are. There's Mary we were taking a tour of the Champagne region and visiting one of these premier champagne vendors and having a tasting. So, but with that, we'll have to be on a different presentation. The Bordeaux region in southwest France also didn't make the cut, and only because I've never been there. So I wanted to cover regions that I had been to. So Bordeaux makes wonderful wines, and I hope to get there someday. The last region that's not covered today is the Languedoc-Roussillon region of southeast France. And this is actually one of France's largest wine regions, and it centers around the medieval town of Carcassonne that we see pictured here. So visiting Carcassonne alone is well worth a trip to France. And the wines here are largely used for just domestic consumption. It's kind of like everyday wines that the French drink. It's not the premier bottles that are selling for $100 plus a bottle, although some of them now are reaching that range. So here are the ones that we are going to look at. We're going to look at southern Provence. We're going to look at the Cote du Rhone region, which is the northern end of Provence, and we're going to look at Burgundy. And as part of this, I'll be talking about the experience of visiting these. These were all visited on different trips that I took. So we'll talk about visiting this region even beyond the wines themselves. So let's take a look. The Provence wines, we're talking about southern Provence, and most people, you can fly directly into Marseille, France. It's very easy to reach here. You could take a train from Paris. I've flown through on Iberia Airlines from Chicago to Madrid and Madrid directly to Marseille. And it's a very cost-effective way to get to Marseille. And for this, notice Avignon is up there, and this is not far from Spain. This is at least that's the road to Spain. That's not Spain itself. That would be the road to Spain. But Aix-en-Provence is a wonderful place to stay on a visit to this area. And these are some of the typical wines from the Provence area. And they're a rosé wine, but it's a very different rosé wine than we typically think of as a sweet wine. These wines are drier. They taste more like a dry white wine than a sweet red wine that we may have drunk years ago. Now, Aix-en-Provence, it's a wonderful city to visit. It's a significant size city, and it has a very extensive for education and technology. But it's an incredibly wonderful city to visit. Here is the central plaza where the tourist center is located. Aix has these wonderful streets, and the beauty of Aix, when you go there, they have one art museum and they have an interesting cathedral, but it's really just to enjoy the good life, for good dining. You don't have to be, when you're in Paris, you almost have to visit all these historic sites. At Aix, you can just sit back and relax. We were there in mid-April, and the weather was delightful. We could visit the cathedral here. Is a delightful cathedral, but this is like a 20-minute visit. You don't have to. You can spend your time relaxing with good food and good wine, and taking some local tours. Lots of outdoor dining in April. The French love to dine outdoors, and the weather is very pleasant in Aix-en-Provence. So probably in January, even in January, it might get windy, but it doesn't get super cold, and certainly nothing like we experience in Chicago. Now, we took an afternoon wine tour. We were visiting this area with two friends, and so we were on a minibus with 4 of us, and I think 4 additional people, and we visited 3 vintners that afternoon. And the first one was a large vintner that had been established for many years. And here, these are the vineyards in April. So the grapes are very early in their growth stage for the year. And so some of these vines could be hundreds of years old, and some could be more recently planted. This is a large vintner, and we were 20 feet. We walked down through a maze of stairs, and 20 feet below ground is that they're storing the wine for aging. So these are, this is from past years. These could be up to 5 or 6 years old, and still aging before they put it on the market. Large growth. You can see the vats. So this vintner can do many thousands of bottles of wine. And there we were enjoying some samples on the right. We went to a second place as well, and this was a much smaller vintner and much newer. So these are where the previous ones that family could have been operating their vintners for centuries. This one is probably well after World War II, and maybe even in the last 20 years, they got up and running. So it's a small family-run vintner with their dog ever present. And this shows some of the classical wine making equipment. A wine press there on the left. Now we're going to move on now to the second region. And the second region is the Cote du Rhone. And here is the Rhone River. So that's where it's got its name. And you can see the hills, the flowing water. just a beautiful part of northern Provence. And here we see in red, we see the region. It begins at Avignon, and Avignon was made famous because the papacy moved from Rome to Avignon in the 1500s, and built a whole town around the papacy. Eventually, they moved back to Rome. But it's a beautiful area. There's mountains, wonderful landscaping, hill-capped villages, and wonderful Roman ruins is available. So this is a delightful area to visit, and this was actually the first place area that I went to in France. But Mary and I went to in about 2006. We went here. So these are some of the types of wine for the Cote du Rhone wines, and they're typically a red blend wine with Grenache, Syrah, and Vintner wine, and I might be mispronouncing that. But this is the typical red blend wine, which makes it a very mellow wine. And right now, Costco has a wonderful Cote du Rhone red blend wine that we've been enjoying. And this is some of the wines from this region could be selling for well over $100. There's good Cote du Rhone wines for under $10 that you can buy as well. It's a very well balanced red blend wine. And here shows a map of the river that we see there, the Rhone River, and these are some of the well-known vintners along the Cote du Rhone region. So so you could have a road map and a guidebook suggesting which of these to stop at, depending on how much time you have. Now, when we stayed here, our home base was the town of Vaison-de-Romaine, and this in itself is a very interesting town. So it actually has two towns in it. One was from the Roman era that we'll look at in a minute, and the second was from the medieval time period. And what we see here is the buildings, including the castle on the top, from the medieval period. And the medieval period, it was very, very chaotic. So there wasn't a unified government like Charlemagne had earlier in time. So there were a lot of bandits. There was protection of your family was very important. So the people in this region, they built homes high up on this hill where they could more easily defend themselves if there was an army or bandits in the area. And there we see on the right, we see the access to the upper town from the medieval period. And we see a bridge there on the right, and this was built by the Romans. And so Julius Caesar crossed this bridge. So this bridge is 2,000 years old and still standing in its glory. And it's not a real wide bridge. It might be 60 yards across this portion of the river, but 2,000 years, and it's still there. People are still driving cars across the bridge. So this is the lower portion of of Vaison-de-Romaine, where it's where the Roman period was very present, and magnificent Roman ruins are here. Here is part of the Roman area. Here is the amphitheater. I mean, so the Provence in general has some of the best Roman ruins that even Roman ruins that you don't see in Italy, they're very present here and very well preserved. Okay, here this is another example of a hill town right near that area. I'm going to back up. There we go. So this is this shows in the medieval time people had to look after and protect themselves. When we were here, we tried to follow the way that the locals ate. So in breakfast, we were often in a bed and breakfast. So we had breakfast at the hotel or at the residence, And then we would eat out lunch, and the French typically take a 2-hour lunch. And so so workers would, and some people would go home for lunch, but oftentimes people are living further away from where they work now. 100 years ago, people lived and worked close by, so they might go home for that 2-hour period. But more often, I think now, co-workers go out and enjoy a nice lunch together and have a major meal of the day at lunch, and then go back to work. So here we are picking out some fruit for dinner, and we would often have wine and cheese and some fruit and bread for dinner, not having our major meal at lunch like the French do, and then have a more modest meal with wine and cheese at night. So one of the places that we visited, this is just one of the many spectacular things to see in Provence, but this is the Abbey of Notre Dame de Sannac, and it dates back to the 1100s, and the monks built this in this very remote valley. And this is a Cistercian monastery, and one of the logics, they picked this in a very remote area, because at the time, many of the monasteries and the convents were not overly religious. They were eating well and drinking well, not praying and doing works of good deeds. So there was a movement to create to go back to the basics of the monastery, where the monks would be working hard, praying hard, and looking forward to the next life, rather than living a comfortable life today. So this is one of these types of monasteries that was part of that movement. And here, let me back up. Here's what it looks like in April when we were there. This is the same monastery in July when the lavender is grown. So these monks specialize in lavender and in honey. That's the main things that they sell, and as well as tourists coming to see the beauty of the monastery. Another amazing thing to visit is the aqueduct at Pointe de Gare, and this is France's greatest Roman ruins. And there I am on the left, and my friend Jim Hoffman, and this aqueduct is bringing water from 30 miles away through the valleys to a town called Nîmes. And most of the 30 miles, the water is in a concrete pipe that's buried in the ground. But when there's a deep valley, they have to keep. You couldn't have the pipes go down, and then the water would never go back up. You'd have to have an electric pump to push the water back up. So the Romans devised these aqueducts to allow the water to flow the entire 30 miles. And look how beautiful that is. And it's a 30-mile aqueduct system with many of these types of bridges that we saw right now. And this one is 150 feet tall. And to the quality of the Roman engineering, the aqueduct, for the water to flow, it has to flow downhill, but it drops 1 inch every 350 feet. And this was done 2,000 years ago. So, and it will give up to 9 million gallons of water to the town of Nîmes, which is 30 miles away. And so that was a major Roman town. And just looking at it from a bird's eye view, I did not take this picture, by the way. You can see there's a crowd of people standing up there. I'm not sure. I'm sure they had to have ladders to get up there. But further to the left of the people, it's covered, and that's covered so that debris would not get into the water and during the Roman time when this was in use. And so you see the people down below walking on the walkway. And even the Romans, if you notice the side of the bridge of the aqueduct, there's stone elements sticking out the side. And that would allow the Roman engineers to make repairs to the structure. And so this is really what the Romans did, amazing engineering. Now, back in the town of Romaine de Provence, we visited the wine co-op, and this was also a wonderful visit. So here we have the wine, and over on one of the walls they had this device that we would call, that we use to pump gas into our cars. They had this connected to a big barrel behind the wall. So people would bring a 1 liter bottle, a glass bottle, and the employee would pump it, fill it with wonderful red wine, and it was at a 1.2 euros. So in today's value, that would be about $1.50 to have a complete liter of wonderful table wine that people would drink that night. Now we actually bought a bottle, but this was very reasonably priced, as you can see from just that example. So we may have paid €2 to buy a 750 milliliter bottle of wine of the same quality that we could have, that the 4 of us could share at dinner. So here is the wine. We were waiting here we got to this vintner on our afternoon wine road trip, and they were closed for 2 hours. So we got there at 1:30, so we had to wait a half hour before they opened up again to give us a tour. So, but again, that's typical French logic. It was more important for their employees to have lunch together than to stay open for the tourists that might come. American logic, people get a 30-minute lunch break. The French would, they are scandalized by that kind of behavior. They say life is meant to be enjoyed. You should have a wonderful, healthy meal. And this goes back even to their schools. The schools take an hour and a half break, and every child in France gets a hot meal in the public school. And it's nutritional, and it's multi-purposed. So first of all, they want the kids to have a nutritious meal, but they also want them to appreciate good food. I mean, again, they'd be shocked that our school kids in grammar school largely get pizza and food that the French would say that's horribly unhealthy. They want their kids to have fresh vegetables and fresh meat, fresh bread. Their standards are very, very high. Now, here we are at a different wine co-op and at a different town. And there's a couple interesting things here. The most interesting thing is the employee sitting on the side behind those wine bottles. So he is there and willing to help you. But unlike American, unlike an American marketing type logic, he's not coming out there and saying, "Can I help you? What kind of price wine do you want?" He's there to help you if you ask for help. But the typical style in much of France, now England is different and Germany is different. Those countries, somebody is there to help you and to introduce themselves. The French, they're more laid back in their marketing. So that was interesting. There is some wine bottles there, glasses that it's available for sampling as well. Now, here is our friend Jim. So Jim and Judy were with us on the trip, and Jim picked up this. It was actually an empty box of a wine box, but that was an interesting picture that I took 18 years ago. And more recently, to prepare for this presentation, I did some research on this, the company that's made the wine that would have been sold in this box. And it's Chateau Rodier. So that's the chateau. So with the marvels of the internet, I was able to do some research on this very vintner. So here's what I found. They have a well-respected vintner. Their wines sell for $30 to $90 a bottle, depending on the year. And there's a critic notes up on top, the purple, blue tints, the fruit, now the French do get into the marketing overkill when they describe their wines, all the characteristics of the wine. So, I'm sure the wine critics have to come up with a way to describe each one differently. But here we have it. And here is the vintner. And now, when I did the research, it turns out this is a vintner it's the family, the Maton family, and their home and their business is in Suzette, France. And here's the telephone number. They have a direct sales, so every day, again from 10 a.m. to noon and from 2 to 5. You can visit and purchase wine and do a tasting. And usually, my experience, most of the time, the tastings are free. Now, some places, at the American style in Napa Valley, you pay $15 or $20 to have a tasting experience. I'm sure in some areas of France, they charge you for that, but many times it seems like they haven't charged us. And so they sell from their own business in their own warehouse, and then the cava that's the communal wine store in the town of Suzette. So here we have. Now Suzette is a town of 126 people. I mean, this is not, this would barely meet the definition of a town in most of the world, but here we have this small village of Suzette, and there is a wine co-op store here, and there's vintners all surrounding this town, so they do get together and support a vintner, a wine co-op. Now, when I did more research on the chateau, here is Eton Mathon, and he started. So this land. In the Middle Ages, it was a fortified stronghold and probably made wine in the Middle Ages. But it was destroyed in the 1800s, perhaps destroyed in the French Revolution. That would have been the second half of the 1800s. But after the turmoil of the 19th century and the wars, in 1956, Etane, he purchased this. It was not a winery or vintage at the time, but he planted wines and in suitable fields and started creating a wine business for himself. And here we see it today. His two daughters now run it, Sabine and Isabel. And there you see the daughters there on the lower left, and the two daughters in the wine vats there. So this is a sizable operation. You can see by the size of those each of those units there could be holding thousands of gallons of wine in their preparation of their vintage. So there we have the Cote du Rhone region. Now the last region we're going to look at today is the Burgundy region, and this is in central France. It's an easy drive from Paris. We drove there, and also a fast train ride to Paris. It's a very serene region. It's quintessential French culture. They really enjoy being French and enjoy the success they have. It's a prosperous area because of wines and other activities that take place here. So these are some of the wine examples here would be Chardonnay and Pinot Noir are two typical wines made in this area. A red wine and the Chardonnay is a white wine. So this very proud of the quality of the wines that they produce. So here when we were visiting here, we stayed in a wine village. And this is near the town of Beaune, which Beaune is near the center of this region for Burgundy wines. So in the wine villages, these were really important. Before automobiles, people had to typically, you wanted to have a village, a wine village in each direction every 2 or 3 miles apart, so that the workers tending the fields near the village, that they might walk a mile or a mile and a half to work, but they weren't walking 3 or 4 miles to work, because particularly because if you're going to work, you're coming back for 2 hours to your home, then you're going back to the vintners. If they were 5 miles away, those workers would either not have to go home for lunch or would have to be walking 20 miles a day to get to tending the vines. So these wine villages tend to be quite close together. Now, unfortunately, wineries are much more mechanized today, so they don't need the same number of workers, which is important because it helps them be economically viable. But these towns are suffering a population decline. And here was a typical town that I did looked up their census, a town called Vannes. 1960, they had over 400 residents. Now, 2020, barely over 200. So they've lost over half of their residents in between since 1960, with a huge drop from 1990. So this is clearly an issue that the French government recognized. So they created a program that offered residents a chance to get a low interest loan to upgrade their home or their and to create rental properties. And so the first place that we stayed here, it was in a building that had been used for commerce, and the owner made 3 apartments in the unit, so 3 homes, and upgraded them so that with plumbing to make them available to tourists. So here we are. Here is where we stayed when we rented, and this, I don't know, this may have been a home before. It doesn't look like a warehouse. So here we are, married, looking out the window to the town, to the little town, but a town where the schools have closed. The kids have to get on a bus and go, probably 10 miles away to where they could gather enough children to have a school. The church has a mass every month, once a month. Now the French don't go to church on average. People don't go to church a whole lot in France, but the church was still important because it was where you could meet friends and see people. Now that a priest comes once a month to the beautiful little church they have, but it's basically out of service. Now here was the apartment that we have. Now notice Mary is sitting next to a little electric heater, and this was just a little mini story. We got there and we stayed here a week. And when we got here, it was cold that night, and we could not get the heaters to work. And so there was a nice bottle of wine on the table as a gift from the family that owned the unit. And we got this from Vacation Rental by Owner, by the way. And the owner grew up in this town, but he actually lived in Vancouver, Canada. So we called him, and and he said, oh, he's very sorry that the heaters don't work. His father and sister still live in the town. So he said he'll call his father, and his father will come over tomorrow and make sure the heaters are working. He said it's probably a fuse that blew. So we said fine. And the father came the next day while we were out touring, and voila, two more bottles of wine appeared as a little thank you for enduring that night without heat. And the rest of the week, it was warm every day and night. So we never actually had to use the heaters, even though we know they would work if we had to. But look how comfortable it is and how nice it is to rent a house or an apartment. You know, you could often get a hotel room for the same money or less money, but when you have your own apartment, you can have food, that you can have your wine and cheese at night. It just makes a whole different atmosphere if you have an apartment or a home rather than just renting a hotel. Now here we are walking out. There's Mary with Judy and Jim. We're walking through the wine fields and the wine road. So this is not a road for cars and trucks. This is for the wine equipment. And our experience is you're perfectly fine to walk through the wine areas. You know, they certainly don't want you to pick wine or pick the grapes, but all the times we walk through these kind of areas, nobody said, "Oh, get out of here, you're trespassing." So that we've never had that experience. Here again, these are the grapes in. This would have been again in April. We tend to go to Europe in the spring or in the fall, and because it's less crowded and the people are much more welcoming before the huge crowds arrive. Here is the town of Beaune, which was one of the wine capitals for the Burgundy region. This is a town, a population of 20,000 people, a nice river running through it. And it's a wonderful town to visit. This is the hotel, the Mansion of God Hotel. And it dates back to the 1400s. It was a medieval charity hospital. And at that time, hospitals typically were where you went to die. That they did not have a lot of cures then. So if you couldn't fight off the disease on your own, you tended to need help just to in your final days. And this is set up to provide that. And it was provided by a rich merchant here. And again, in the Middle Ages, your belief in the afterlife was very strong. You wanted to earn your reward in the afterlife. So creating a charity or giving your lots of money to the monks to build a monastery, that was quite common among the rich people. And Beaune is also famous for its annual wine auction. And this is a week festival, and it's the most famous wine auction, and it serves multiple purposes. It's a way to raise money, but it's also a way for people to judge the wine and determine if the 2022 vintage, is that a spectacular vintage that will justify $150 a bottle, or is it just an average vintage where the best wines sell for $70 a bottle? So it helps determine the quality of the vintage from experts that come in, and the many thousands of people that come in, some for just a good party and others as part of the wine business. Here we see beautiful fields. We took in this area every time. We typically, when we think of these trips, we were spending a week in this area, or we spent a week in the Cote du Rhone area. And there's so much to do. Actually visiting wineries is, that might be a one day of the 6 days that we're there. But here we visited a local chateau. So here, this was interesting. Here we see the wines growing, and this owner of this chateau, he collected warplanes. He also had a huge array of motorcycles, like over 100 motorcycles on display. And so people would come to taste his wine, but also to visit the Warplane Museum. And he collected Soviet MiG planes. There's, mainly World War II and Cold War planes. Lots of jets that he would acquire. And by his own admission, he said, "I am warplane rich, money poor." So he spent so much money on the warplanes, it basically took up all his income. And there we see him standing in a photo with us. So there's Mary and I on the left, Judy and Jim on the right, and the owner of the chateau in the middle. And we drank some of his wine here, and it was a fun experience. To our palate, this was not great wine. Now, and that I say that, and it's not necessarily the fault of the wine. But many times when we taste high cost wine in France, it's not to our taste. Some of this, sometimes the French like wine that has a very distinctive aftertaste and flavoring, where I tend to like the more milder red blend wines. So I would not claim to be a judge of wine, but this, in terms of my taste, I much prefer the Cote du Rhone red blend, because it's a milder wine than a more mellow wine than the wines we tasted at his vineyard. So I don't know how others would judge his wine, but it certainly didn't pass our test. So until the next visit, that's kind of the world of the French, the 3 French regions that we covered. I can't stress enough how much, sometimes the people in Paris get the reputation that they're not friendly to tourists or to Americans, and actually that has not been our experience, but that's their reputation. But that's certainly not true in southern France or the regions we just discussed. They welcome tourists. We were in Provence near Arles once, and there was a plaque next to this bridge that had been destroyed. And the plaque said, "The brave Americans came and destroyed this bridge to help free us from the Nazis." I mean, thanking Americans. And even though our bombing probably killed hundreds of people when we were bombing that region to free it from the Nazis, but they talked about the positive of how we helped free them from the Nazis, and that's typical of the welcome in southern France and the welcome in wine regions. Now we've also had a warm welcome in Paris for many people, but other Americans claim they've had a cold shoulder in Paris. So I won't dispute their claim, but it certainly has not been my experience. So Nicolette, any questions or comments from our audience?
We're going to give everyone a moment to put their questions in. I did have a question.
Yes.
All these different regions, are they all walkable, or were you using different forms of transportation besides train?
Okay, so it's a great question. So to visit, we always had a car when we visited these 3 regions, with the exception that first region of by Aix-en-Provence, we did not have a car. You don't need a car in the town, and but we signed up for a minivan wine tour. So on that trip, we did not have a car. In the Cote du Rhone region and the Burgundy region, we did have a car. So if you did not have a car, you could certainly get to these regions and take minivan tours out to the vineyards. So that's certainly an option. You don't, driving is optional. Although I should say the roads in France are very good. The cars are, you drive, unlike England and Ireland, you're driving on the same side of the road that we do in the US. So driving in these regions is much easier than it is in Ireland and England. But if you don't have a car, you can still take tours out to the vineyards where you stay in one of the middle-sized towns or a larger town.
That's really cool. Thank you for that. I appreciate that.
You're welcome.
All right. We're not seeing any questions at the moment, but I'll go ahead and give everyone a little bit more time. Thank you so much, Gene, for presenting. That was fantastic.
Well, thank you.
You were
Thank you.
super thorough. And here we go. We have a great question here. Do the French import wines from other places like Australia, the US, or South Africa to sell?
I'm sure they do, particularly in the cities, in the large cities like Paris. You can see wines from all over the European Union, or the major towns. They will have stores that do import wines, and particularly the wines from Germany have unique characteristics. The white wines from Germany, those you will see those in the larger stores. In the small village co-ops, those are just selling local wines. And you can go, in most French towns, you will see something equivalent to an Aldi that will have wines particularly from Germany and from Spain. Probably not so much from South America or South Africa, but certainly other European countries make their wines available, and the wines are very inexpensive by our standards. When we go out to eat in Europe, you might be paying more for your entree, but you're getting a bottle of wine for $15, and you still get a decent bottle of wine. Where here, you might be paying less for your entree, but you might be paying $45 for a bottle of wine. The wines relatively are a bargain in Europe.
That's good to know. That's super cool. All right, Dorothy has a question. Does the aqueduct to Nîmes still carry water today?
It does not. Yeah, so it over time, it does not. Somehow that water link was disconnected. The beauty, though, the Europeans by and large value antiquity, and you look at America. We don't keep our old beautiful buildings. We tend to knock them down and build new skyscrapers. The Europeans, they pay to keep that aqueduct. I'm sure it has to be inspected and it's well engineered, but they still have to make sure it's safe. But they value that aqueduct is there as part of their 2,000-year history in connection with the Roman Empire. So they really value their history in a wonderful way.
I also wish we preserved things a little bit better.
Absolutely.
Awesome. Well, those are all the questions that we've received. Thank you to everyone who attended today's Travelogue. The next Travelogue will be on February 20th and will be on Bangladesh, presented by Keith Yearman.